Please, we are tired. Either you leave us to die in peace, or either tell the world the truth.
Shaker, they chain your body, but they cannot chain your mind.
So it's called We Stand with Shaker, and this came about obviously because we were trying to get out of Guantanamo the last British resident in Guantanamo, a man called Shaker Aamer, a man who, whenever he was described by his lawyers or by anyone who'd had anything to do with him, was always described as someone who was charismatic. Charismatic, intelligent, and absolutely driven by his desire to combat the injustice with which the men at Guantanamo were being treated. And how they'd been treated before they arrived at Guantanamo, because in Afghanistan, before they were sent to Guantanamo, it was even more brutal. The Guantanamo place has been a kind of torture prison where a lot of it's been psychological. In Afghanistan, it was just physically brutal. It was horrible what they did to people there. It's horrible what they do in Guantanamo, but there are kind of different ways that it's happened. And throughout, from the very beginning, Shaker Aamer, who speaks fluent English, obviously, he'd lived in America as a young man, then he'd moved to the UK in the early 90s, he'd met a woman here, he got married, he had 4 kids, he actually had 3 kids when he was captured. His youngest son was born on the day he arrived at Guantanamo. They'd gone out to Afghanistan in the summer of 2001 to take part in humanitarian aid projects, setting up a girls' school and some well digging projects. And like the people that I was mentioning earlier, got caught up in that. So his wife and the kids managed to escape, and Shaker didn't. So he ended up in US custody. Suddenly they've got this guy. He was a big guy at the time. He's really not now. He lost a considerable amount of weight in Guantanamo. They had him there, and he was railing against them from the beginning, saying, you've got to treat us fairly, you've got to treat us with justice, you've got to treat us humanely. Where are the Geneva Conventions? And they pretty swiftly decided that he must be somebody really significant. He was a significant thorn in their side, but he wasn't who they thought he was. They decided that he was a top Al-Qaeda man, whereas he was just a top man who believed in justice in the middle of this chronic system of injustice that the United States has set up. So they sent him out to Guantanamo, and they came up with a lot of lies about him. Now the files against the prisoners, I mentioned earlier that there were unclassified files that were released in 2006 which said things like a senior Al-Qaeda operative said that he saw the detainee in a guest house in Kabul associated with Al-Qaeda in the summer of 1999, this kind of thing. In April 2011, WikiLeaks released via Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning, files on the Guantanamo prisoners that were previously classified military files. So they're basically the same information, but more of it, and actually this time with the people named who make the allegations. Now, what's very interesting is that if you're a really kind of dense right-winger, then you read these documents and go, it's just amazing, isn't it, how much information there is here about how bad these people are. Because all kinds of accusations are flung at them. But I can really honestly say that a very small amount of that is at all credible. Now basically you need to understand that almost nobody that was held in Guantanamo was able to resist the pressure that was put on them to tell lies about other people. So if they couldn't break you, and they tried to break people using torture and other forms of abuse, they would try and bribe you. Would you like a burger in your cell every night? Would you like to watch movies? Would you like some cigarettes? Would you like some alcohol? I don't know how far that went. You know, pornography, prostitutes, we've heard all kinds of things over the years. But certainly they would give you comfort items, because there was very little in the way of comfort items. In fact, there was nothing in the way of comfort items if you were uncooperative in Guantanamo. So the files have a large number of prisoners saying about other prisoners, implicating them in various things. most of which, is fairly dubious. And then there are regular appearances by a cast of characters who are all over the files, none of whom are reliable. So in the case of Shaker Aamer, there are really two areas of what was supposed to be alarming about Shaker Aamer and why he was dangerous. And one concerned Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan, and the other concerned people that he'd met in Britain, where he's reported to have, known people associated with terrorism in Britain. I think that one pretty swiftly unravels when you realise that at the mosques people were meeting all kinds of people, and none of that really means anything. In terms of Afghanistan, it says in the file that he was a member of Al-Qaeda, that he met Osama bin Laden, that he was a commander at the Battle of Tora Bora. So Tora Bora was this big showdown between the Taliban and the Americans, but the Americans actually got the Afghans to do their fighting for them and did a bit of bombing. But he wasn't any of these things, and he wasn't there. And the people who made the allegations, one of them is a man called Abu Zubaydah. Now, Abu Zubaydah was the facilitator for an independent military training camp in Afghanistan that wasn't run by Al-Qaeda and wasn't affiliated with Al-Qaeda. When the Americans and the Pakistanis picked him up in Pakistan in a house raid in March 2002, they said, even though some of their intelligence would have already went against this, they said, he's a big guy in Al-Qaeda, we're going to have to do some terrible things to him. So they specifically set up their torture program for him. He was flown, first of all, to Thailand, where they had a secret torture prison for a while. He was then flown to Poland, where they had another secret torture prison for a while. Lithuania and Romania were places that they also had secret torture prisons, and Morocco. They used other countries' facilities where they didn't do the hands-on torturing, they got those other countries to do it. And Abu Zubaydah, for whom the torture program was invented, was not a significant player in Al-Qaeda at all, knew nothing even about 9/11, didn't know it was going to happen. Over the years, they've walked back from all the claims that they made about him, and they've walked back from backing the claim that came from him about Al-Qaeda and Shaker Aamer in Afghanistan, because Shaker Aamer was approved for release in 2007 under President Bush. He was approved for release again under President Obama, who set up a task force to review all the prisoners' cases in 2009. But if you look at the stories about Shaker Aamer, you will see these claims. And another claim came from a Yemeni prisoner who I think he had mental health issues, but he is, I think, in the files of at least 130 prisoners, making claims about them which are patently untrue. He was touted by the authorities as a really great witness at the beginning, and then even a lot of the US intelligence people started to realize that he had made claims that they couldn't back up. So some judges who were looking at the prisoners' cases in connection with the habeas litigation started saying, you can't trust this man. Unless you've got verification of what he says from other sources, he's untrustworthy. There was another man who's in Shaker's file. So these are the three key people. The third man in Shaker's file is a Saudi man who, get this, was liberated from a Taliban jail by the US forces after the US-led invasion. He had been imprisoned by the Taliban as a spy. They thought he was a spy. So he'd been imprisoned, abused in custody. He was liberated by the Americans, who then sent him to Guantanamo. There were about 5 or 6 guys at least that this happened to. He wasn't really in a fit state. And the authorities ended up, it's on record, that this guy's testimony is unreliable as well. So the case against Shaker doesn't exist. Shaker ends up being told in 2007 and 2009 that he can go home, and yet he doesn't go home. So why is that? Well, it's because, I think it has to be because of how vocal he was in opposition to what had happened in Guantanamo, that they feared what would happen when they released him, what he would say. Now, Shaker knows a few things about some terrible things that have happened in Guantanamo. And the recent interview that he did I don't know whether any of you have seen, some of you obviously have seen the BBC interview. There's a whole 1.5 hours on YouTube. We're going to watch a little bit soon. He can't talk about what he knows about a man called Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi. He was the commander of the camp that Abu Zubaydah was the facilitator for. And Shaker and al-Libi ended up in custody at the same time after they were captured. And then al-Libi was flown by the CIA to Egypt, where he was tortured, and he said that there were connections between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, specifically that Saddam Hussein was trying to facilitate Al-Qaeda buying chemical weapons, and lo and behold, that confession, that tortured confession, was used to justify the illegal invasion of Iraq in March 2003. And Colin Powell, to his eternal shame, stood up in the United Nations in February 2003 and repeated what al-Libi, who had been tortured in Egypt, said, which was a pack of lies. So Shaker knows something about al-Libi, and he's not at liberty to talk about that at the moment. So there's some legal case ongoing with the connection there. And he's also not allowed to talk at the moment about the deaths of 3 men at Guantanamo on the same night, June the 9th, 2006, when 3 men allegedly committed suicide simultaneously in a suicide pact, which has always seemed incredible. There have been many occasions over the years when it's been challenged, and most particularly by the man who was in charge of the people in the watchtowers, who was observing the movements of traffic that night of the various vehicles, who has made an extremely convincing case that it simply couldn't have been that they committed suicide. That they were probably taken to a secret facility somewhere else where they were very badly abused, and whether deliberately or not, were actually killed. It could have been a torture session that wasn't meant to kill them, but did. No one's, I mean, we don't know because they won't investigate it openly and properly. And Shaker has said that on that night he was also treated very, very badly. So, you know, these are things that obviously they wouldn't want him to talk about. But I honestly think the general thing is that, look, this guy is so eloquent and so charismatic and so convincing and such a good human being compared to the people who had put him there and told all these lies about him, that's really why they didn't want him out. And because of the lawlessness of Guantanamo, because there isn't a prison sentence that you finish, because there isn't a war that has ended at the end of which you have to be freed, because they still won't accept that their war on terror has ended. They won't accept that war is over in Afghanistan. You know, it's been going on longer than the First World War and the Second World War put together, but it goes on forever, just as Bush wanted the forever war. Then, you know, there's no way out unless they want you out. It's all political. And so I think politically it was convenient for them to say, just keep your foot in the back of the queue, because he's only going to cause us trouble. So year after year went by, not because this man had done anything wrong, but because they didn't want to be embarrassed by him. So I think we could now watch a little bit of Shaker talking.
How would you describe it?
You know, the closest thing for my mind, you know, is Harry Potter story, you know, because I read it. You know, they got an island in Harry Potter, it says Azkaban, where there's no happiness. They you know, they just suck all your feelings out of you. And you don't have no feeling anymore. And truly, that's what I felt all the time, is this is Azkaban, this is not from this world, you know, because that's what they tried, you know. They want to make you feelingless. They want to deprive you from anything. Even this feeling of belonging to something, or this is my cell. You can't even say this is my cell. You can't. Because they keep making you do things inside the cell that against your will.
FCE stands for forced cell extraction.
Yes.
In terms of the kind of interrogation you received at Guantanamo Bay, can you describe that for us?
Again, I said, you know, they really not looking for the truth. They're not looking for answers, you know. They're just looking to blame you on something, regardless if you are telling the truth. As soon they see you, you know, giving them some answers that, you know, it shows you that you are a human being, they won't accept it.
But what are they asking you?
You know, one of the incidents really, I can't forget, I cannot, because I don't know much about 9/11. Truly, I don't know much about it. I don't know, what happened there, truly. So for me, it's just like, two building collapse, And one day I was in the interrogation, and the interrogator brought a book, and it has all scenery from 9/11. And then he kept opening, one page after another page. And then suddenly he stopped on a page where somebody jumped from all the way up, God knows, 100th floor or something, and he's jumping, running away from the fire. So I looked at it, and in my mind, the guy is going to get killed by fire, but he knows when he jumps, he's going to get killed anyway. So I start crying. And he looked at me, he couldn't believe it. He's crying. So he grabbed that huge book, and he just picked it up and smacked it on the table. And he looked at me, "You crying? You did this?" I said, "I didn't do nothing, man. Why do you think I did that?" And that's why I felt they really, they don't want to even believe you are a human being. They don't want you to feel that, I'm just a man with feelings, just like you. But they don't want to believe that. And when they get to these moments where you show them that you have feelings just like them, they hate it because they know what they are doing to you.
How did these interrogations at Guantanamo differ to what happened to you, you say, at Bagram and Kandahar?
In Guantanamo, they were more careful. It's more discreet. It's more, all the method of the torture in Guantanamo is totally, has like I told you, like a cover-up for it. With certain groups, they are willing to cover everything, and nobody will even see them and talk to them, because these guys, they just work nights. And one of those groups, I remember, they call it 94. So they can practice all this torture, they practice all this humiliation, because themselves, they feel like, like we are the people who done it, so let's just take revenge.
What was going on at night to you?
First off, they have the interrogation room, which is, they have a building, they call it gold building, because they have silver, they have gold, they have brown.
And you called it what?
I used to call it coal building, because if you see the building in the old time, it has a fridge door, those big freezers, and for the reason to keep all the cold inside. And they used to drag you there. The air condition is full blast 24 hours there, and there is a lot of equipment, the music and things there, and they just stick you inside one of these rooms, which is freezing cold, and they just tie you on the ground, and you will be sitting there for one day, 36 hours, 24 hours, and they will never allow you to go to the toilet. In the beginning, we held ourselves, but in the end, we couldn't, because you can't, so we start doing it on ourselves. So they realized that, and then the place got stunk, they got so bad. Then they said no more. You have to take him back to go to the toilet, because they cannot afford to, because they have to be also with us in the room sometimes.
Is it true that you and other detainees, after a period of time, would automatically get diarrhea when you were told you were about to be interrogated?
Till now it happens.
Would you like to see the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, the then Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, held to account for what you say happened to you at that time?
The only thing I really would like to happen is for Tony Blair and for whoever in the government at that time is to tell the truth, just like I'm telling the truth to the world. The only goal I have at this time is to stop what's happening, which is still happening, which is Guantanamo. The only thing I want is nobody will do it again to anybody else, regardless. Because we are human beings, even if we did something wrong. Those people in Guantanamo, they are human beings. Even if the whole world think they did something wrong, they should be tried like human beings. They should be treated like human beings, because they are not fighting anymore. They just locked up. So why not treating them like human beings?
Do you believe Tony Blair knew what was going on at Bagram at that time?
Oh, definitely. They know, all of them, they know what they were doing. Because, if these guys at the head of the state, they don't know, who's supposed to know?
Well, he's good, isn't he?
Yeah, he's incredibly strong.
Yeah, he's
very,
unbelievably.
very
I mean,
strong.
people that go through that, you'd expect them to just crumble into pieces, but
He's
so
unbelievably
strong.
resilient. I mean, that's the thing, is that I heard Clive Stafford Smith, one of his lawyers, told me that in 2012, so 2013 there was a massive prison-wide hunger strike which really focused people's minds back on the prison. But in 2012 it was kind of disappearing from view, as it frequently does in the media. And so, it's a bubble, that place, the people that are in there. And so Shaka was engaged in this struggle with the authorities, and what he did, so this is a sign of how he refused to back down, to keep his strength, to keep his dignity, to not be broken. He was in isolation. They kept him in isolation for a huge amount of time because anybody that they regarded as having an influence over the other prisoners, they tried to keep them away from them.
He said it was over like two years, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was one particular period when it was nearly 2 years where he befriended the ants and the birds, which is a very moving bit. But this period, he was in isolation. They would then let him out for recreation for 1 hour a day, where they put you in a yard. Maybe you can see a bit of sky, but they put him in the yard for an hour, and then at the end of the hour they would say, 239, come back in. They always called them by their numbers, not by their names. 239, it's time to come back in. And he went, no, I'm not coming. So they would then get the 5 tooled up guys, the extreme reaction force, which is what the prisoners call it. I think it's called the immediate reaction force, according to the authorities. These guys who beat up the prisoners for every infringement of the rules. So he would say, no, I'm not coming in. And they would beat him up and they would drag him in. And he just did, this went on for days and days and days. I think this went on for weeks. It might even have gone on for months. And then they gave up. He won. They gave up. And that was what he was trying to get them to do, was he was going to break them. He was not going to be broken by them. And that's why he spent all this time in isolation. I know back in, I think it was 2011, I was friends with a military lawyer who represented one of the prisoners who was also regarded as having a big influence on his fellow prisoners. And there were 10 of them who were kept in a block away from everybody else. And when you looked at this was why. It wasn't because they were bad guys. It wasn't because of anything other than the fact that they had an influence on other prisoners. And that when you looked at them, all of them had either said nothing about their fellow prisoners or very little. Mainly they'd not been broken. And when I say broken, I mean it as no criticism of anybody who broke, because I'm sure most of us honestly would think, well, how could you not? There was a Q80 guy, and a journalist friend of mine found that he was all over the files, and she met him a few years back and said, can I ask you about these specific allegations that you made about such and such? And he went, you can, but I'm not going to know the answer. He said, all that happened was that at a certain point, I just gave up. There wasn't anything in particular. They weren't really horrible to me. But, they were dragging me out for interrogation, in the middle of the night, over and over again. And eventually I just couldn't be bothered to fight them anymore. I couldn't do it. So he said, from that point on, I just said yes to everything. So yeah, that's all over the files, but none of it's true. And that happened a lot. But Shaka, he's not in those files.
I thought it was very fascinating where he analysed it by saying that they couldn't bear it when he showed he had humanity and was upset. And I guess by refusing to come in, being beaten up every day, he was doing that. He was really getting inside them.
And the fact is that he's fluent in English. So if you think about a lot of those prisoners, a lot of them are now fluent in English. They haven't officially learnt it. They've learnt it through as a byproduct of their experience. But from the beginning, most of the prisoners couldn't engage with the authorities. Whereas Shaka and all the English-speaking guys could. I didn't really say much about We Stand With Shaka. We Stand With Shaka involved, because Shaka wasn't here, involved a giant inflatable figure of him, because I was at a meeting in Parliament convened by John McDonnell MP, who at the time was one of the most ferocious dissenting left-wing Labour MPs, and now is the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. Isn't it amazing how things go?
Yeah.
John, a year ago, set up the Shaker Aamer parliamentary group, which Jeremy Corbyn was a prominent member of. And at a meeting 2 years ago, I said, look, I think what we need something to raise Shaker's case. So I was imagining that we would have, like the elephant in the room, a giant figure of Shaker Aamer that would rear up behind Tory ministers whenever they appeared in public. Which, would be great to think that you could, get that close to David Cameron and inflate a giant Shaker Aamer behind him, but of course the security wouldn't really allow that. So it evolved into what it became, which was that at the meeting, this activist called Joanne McInnes came along and said, I like that idea, I'm going to pay to get the inflatable done, and then we'll see what we can do with it. And she was amazing at getting MPs and celebrities to stand with Shaker, and it became part of the successful campaign that got him out. The MPs coming on board was massive, and the unlikely, well, I shouldn't say unlikely, and the support of the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail is, not generally friendly to Muslims, but is friendly to Muslims when they have been wronged in accordance with the rule of law, because the Daily Mail doesn't like torture and respects the rule of law. But, those are two of the areas in which I can say good things about them.
Do you think that Guantanamo will ever close?
Yeah, well, I do think that it will eventually have to close, but the circumstances in which that's going to happen are still unclear. There are 107 men still held at Guantanamo. Of those 107, 48 have been told by the US authorities that they don't want to hold them anymore. Shaker was one of them. Not all, 37 of those people were told by the task force that President Obama convened in 2009. So this was a multi-agency task force they met every week and reviewed the prisoners' cases. So 37 of those men, they said we're not interested in holding them or putting them on trial, but they're still there. And the reason is not, as it was with Shaker, that they were going to embarrass them in particular. It's that most of them are Yemenis, and the entire US establishment won't return Yemenis to their home country because of the security situation, which has degenerated into something particularly terrible now, where we seem to be supporting Saudi Arabia in the massive killing of civilians in Yemen. But for the years before that, ironically, America was involved in kind of covert bombing and drone attacks in Yemen that were enraging people, so that an Al-Qaeda offshoot started in Yemen, which the Americans then used to justify why Yemen was a dangerous place. And part of the collateral damage of this whole Yemen situation has been that they won't send any Yemenis home. So they have to find third countries that will offer them a new home, and that involves it definitely involves large envelope stuffed full of cash. It also involves, diplomatic arrangements that will be beneficial to the countries that are going to help America with this problem. That leaves 59 other men in Guantanamo, who are a mixture of a very small number of people who are facing trials. 10. And 49 others who are the media has dubbed them forever prisoners, because they were, when the task force was deciding who to approve for release and who to recommend for prosecution, they said, we've got a bunch of guys here, there were 48 at the time, they said, we think they're too dangerous to release, but we can't prove it. In other words, the evidence against them, they couldn't use in a court, which means it's not evidence, which means that all those problems with the evidence that I was talking to you about before is all over their files, that's not necessarily trustworthy. If they haven't got proof against these people except what people put under forms of duress or bribery said, then it's not reliable. It turns out that sometimes what they actually mean is these people have got a bad attitude. Some of these people have been hunger strikers for years, or some of these people, under the oppression of indefinite imprisonment without charge or trial for 14 years, have persistently said terrible things to their captors, like, I'm going to hunt you down afterwards, and I'm going to join Al Qaeda after I go. Whatever. You know, you can imagine, can't you? So a lot of it's been their attitude. There's a review process that they've set up in the last few years at Guantanamo, which is basically a risk mitigation. It says, if these forever prisoners go before another interagency board and basically, you know, tug the forelock and say, you know, I'm a reformed character, and get their lawyers to work with them to demonstrate that they've got a good family, that they're going to look for work, then they're getting approved for release. And actually, that is happening. And it is whittling down that number. So, but it's all happening too slowly because Obama's out in 14 months. Now, I'm hoping, really hoping that, you know, I have no great love for Hillary Clinton, but obviously I'm hoping that it's not Donald Trump or any of the other Republican candidates, because they're all barking now. And if they got in, of course, that would be a disaster for Guantanamo. If Clinton gets in, I think that it would be more or less the same as it is now. Obama should have the opportunity to finish what he promised. Whether he has to do that by bypassing Congress through executive power rather than with the support of Congress, that's difficult, because then he has to, you know, get a facility somewhere on the US mainland that he can, it's not clear how that's going to happen. It's possible that he will somehow get Congress to work with him, but they've been making it very difficult for years and years.
Is that
Absolutely an obstruction to him. Huh?
Is that why he hasn't done anything?
Yeah, I mean, what it's been is that he has tried to work with Congress, and he's been unwilling to override Congress, even though he can do that legislatively, because that will, you know, accelerate the war with the Republicans, who will try and make life difficult for him in other ways. So he's chosen not. The way I usually put it is that he's chosen not to spend political capital really dealing with Guantanamo, even though as the president he can do certain things, and maybe he will. The thing with Guantanamo still, and the reason that some very, very dodgy people want to keep it open, is that they like imprisoning people without charge or trial. And you know, and that's the heart of Guantanamo. Why, having started what I do, I'm going to carry on, because although I care about the individual stories of the people that I've found out about, it's also the principle. The principle is that we in the West cannot allow our governments to start imprisoning people on their say-so, that it's like, there's no process here, you have to trust us, these are the bad guys. Because it seems to me that it took a very, very long time to get us the protection from that kind of executive abuse of power in the first place, that you know, that we can't give it back to them, because, you know, it's the Muslims now, but really, honestly, next time around it'll be somebody else, and it's unacceptable that that should be happening. I just wanted to say last thing about Shaker Aamer, because when Shaker Aamer came out, there was then a lot of discussions about who he was going to talk to in the media, and at the same time, those of us who had worked to get him out wanted to meet him, and so we had a secret meeting in Parliament a couple of weeks after he was released, which we all, I think, managed to keep quiet about. And it was very, very lovely to meet him, and he really is, like you saw there, but he's kind of talking. He was talking very seriously there. He was obviously, you know, quite high on everything to meet the people. He met a lot of the MPs. You know, Jeremy Corbyn came and met him with John McDonnell, the Tory MPs who'd supported him, and the campaigners. And he was, as he is there, you know, those amazing dancing eyes, that amazing smile, and this, you know, this fantastic compassion and intelligence. And there's a few photos that I just wanted to show you that have not been seen before. So that's me on the left, obviously. That's Joanne McInnes, that's Shaker, and that's Suleiman Ghani, who was the imam of the mosque that the family used to go to, who's also been working for years to get Shaker out. And that's in. So where we were in the room that is used by the Shadow Cabinet, which is very nice. That's Joy Hercombe at the front, who is the chair of the Save Shaker Aamer campaign, who were, in all weathers, were outside Parliament every Wednesday wearing orange, campaigning to get Shaker out. And the woman between me and Shaker is Patricia, who's also prominent in that group. And that was that was me and Shaker getting on. I don't know what he was saying there, but he can talk.
Who's the woman on the right?
Oh, that is Salia Ahsan, who's a doctor and a broadcaster, multi-talented doctor and broadcaster. She does a lot of work in A&E, and then suddenly I'll find that she's just in some other country, and it's like, what's she doing? She's gone there to make a film about something, and very nice woman. Very. I almost wonder whether there are two of her because she seems to be in so many different places. Well, I think those are the photos.
What about his family? Are they okay?
Well, it's really difficult because his wife was very depressed during his detention. I mean, clinically depressed. She was in hospital on numerous occasions. So that's not great, obviously. And he has an 18-year-old daughter, so she remembers him, and 3 slightly younger teenage sons who don't really, and who have grown up without him, and not only without him, but with their father in this weird position. What do you do if you're the son of somebody who was in Guantanamo, where he hasn't been tried or convicted of anything, and yet apparently he's the worst of the worst. So I think it's really difficult. And
also in later on in the documentary, the interview, he was talking about all the chronic conditions he has. I mean, he does come across as this immensely mentally strong person.
Yeah.
But when he was talking about the walling where the heads were smacked repeatedly.
No, I can't imagine it because
I mean, that would just kill me. I mean, that'd be me done.
Well, when I met him, I thought he was in better shape than me, and I thought, well, how's that possible? But clearly, there is a lot going on, and I think I would think that his resilience will continue, in fundamentally that he's that's who he is, but negotiating. Re-establishing these relationships must be really hard.
He's opted not to take legal action.
He apparently has, yes. I think that there is, however, a settlement from a financial settlement from the government, based around a civil claim for damages that all the former prisoners brought against the government. I think it was 4 years ago. Which was very interesting because a judge started ordering documents to be released, and the first batch of documents contained some information that was so embarrassing that they immediately got their lawyers on and said, look, reach a deal with these guys to drop the civil claim for damages. We don't care how you do it. We don't care what money you spend. I remember from that batch there were 2 documents in particular. There was Jack Straw on January the 10th, 2001, the day before Guantanamo opened, basically saying, we haven't really got a problem so long as you're going to allow us access to interview these people. And then there's a memo from Tony Blair preventing consular access to a British national who was kidnapped in Zambia and sent to Guantanamo. And Tony Blair directly intervening to stop him being provided with consular assistance. So, we never got to see what else there was going to be in those files. But there is apparently money from that settlement that was put aside for Shaker that he's going to get. Now, I can't imagine that it would include any discussion of silencing him in any way. And I think it's clear that what he's going to be wanting to push for is, like he says, is not punishment of the people who did wrong, but for the truth to come out. So a lot of the organisations involved want a judge-led inquiry. There was an inquiry that was promised and set up by the Tories under the coalition government, which was whose remit was so narrow that all the NGOs and lawyers refused to support it. And so that limped on to some kind of feeble conclusion, but was discredited. So there needs to be a proper, objective analysis of what took place. And of course, none of us would be surprised to hear that that's pretty much the last thing that the British government would want. But we'll see where it goes. I mean, I think it's very interesting that he just wants the truth. I mean, it's similar in a way, and I don't even know whether Shaker knows this case yet, but there was a Libyan dissident called Abdel Hakim Belhaj, and the British authorities were directly complicit in his kidnapping and rendition through a couple of countries, I think, back to Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, where his wife was held and abused even though she was pregnant, and Belhaj was then held and tortured and abused for, I think, 6 years. And he is seeking £1 damages from the British government. What he wants is for them to officially acknowledge their complicity. And that's a case that's still working its way through the British courts. So there's a lot that they want to hide, and there's a lot of reasons why they shouldn't be able to hide it. So I hope that all of us who care will be following this issue over the next 3 years.
Prison still active.
Well, not the network that was set up by the Bush administration. All of that closed down. They didn't really have, it wasn't a long-term project to persuade other countries to host torture prisons that they couldn't host in their own countries. I mean, that's such a horrible idea, isn't it?
But the very
Can we host a torture prison here because we can't do it at home?
But what the fact of that is the very fact that it happened just means it can happen again.
It could happen again. I mean, it certainly could happen again with a different administration. I mean, who's to say what would happen, because nobody has been actually held accountable for what did take place.
That's the point.
What I understand is happening is that the United States is involved in so many countries in so many different ways around the world, and that in places where there's a front line that involves people that they want to question under dubious circumstances, there are forward operating bases, or perhaps we could even say secret prisons in certain places. I think things that are happening in Somalia, for example, and a few other places, they may only be holding people for a short amount of time. They may be using, this gets a bit technical, but there's an appendix to the Army Field Manual, which is all about humanely treating people that are captured. But an appendix says, oh, here's a whole bunch of torture techniques that you can use in specific cases if you get the approval of the commanding officer. So it would be unfair to say that they're generally behaving in a law-abiding manner. Plus, the biggie, really, actually they found that it was much easier to kill using drone attacks people that they didn't like, without them having been charged or tried of anything. And the British, of course, got involved in that recently by David Cameron authorising the execution by drone of British citizens in Syria. Little drink break, toilet break, and then a bit of music.
Shaker, they chain your body, but they cannot chain your mind. You tell the truth to power.